"Remove her from the table," my daughter-in-law said loudly enough for the entire restaurant to hear. "She doesn't belong here." The violinist near the fireplace stopped playing for half a second. Glasses froze halfway to people's lips. Even the waiters looked uncomfortable. I sat very still at the end of the long white tablecloth while my son stared down at his plate as if the grilled salmon in front of him required his full attention. Vanessa adjusted the diamond bracelet on her wrist and gave the security guard a polished smile that almost hid the cruelty underneath it. "Please," she added softly, "before she embarrasses us any further." I folded my linen napkin carefully and placed it beside my untouched salad plate. Around me, the dining room of the Hawthorne Country Club glowed with warm chandelier light and quiet wealth. Crystal glasses sparkled. Women in silk dresses laughed behind manicured hands. Men in tailored navy jackets discussed stock markets and vacation homes in Aspen. And there I sat in my old cream cardigan that suddenly seemed too plain for the room I had once walked into proudly beside my late husband for over 30 years. "I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end, and tell me where you're watching from, because tonight's story still feels unreal even to me." The security guard hesitated beside my chair. He looked young, maybe early 30s, broad shoulders, neatly trimmed beard, the kind of face that still carried traces of kindness. "Ma'am," he said quietly, almost apologetically, "I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Vanessa leaned back in her chair with the satisfied expression of someone finally correcting a problem that had irritated her for years. Across the table, my son Daniel finally looked up, but only for a moment. His eyes met mine briefly before sliding away again. That hurt more than Vanessa's words ever could. Daniel used to cry whenever I left him at kindergarten. He used to slip handwritten Mother's Day cards under my bedroom door. Now he couldn't even defend me while strangers watched his mother being escorted out of a family dinner. I stood slowly, smoothing my skirt with hands that trembled far less than I expected. Humiliation has a strange effect on you when you reach my age. At 69, your heartbreak becomes quieter, heavier, more controlled. You stop expecting kindness from people who have already decided your value expired years ago. Vanessa lifted her wine glass as I stepped away from the table. "Honestly," she muttered to the woman beside her, "some people just don't know when they're no longer wanted." A few nervous laughs circled the table. I felt every one of them land against my back like cold rain. The security guard walked beside me through the dining room in uncomfortable silence. Then, just as we reached the marble hallway near the entrance, he suddenly slowed down. His eyes moved toward the enormous black and white photograph hanging above the fireplace wall. My late husband stood smiling in the center of it beside rows of wine barrels, one arm around me, both of us younger, proud, exhausted, happy. Beneath the frame, engraved into polished brass, were 6 simple words: "Founders of Carter Estates Winery." The young guard looked back at me, his face draining of color. "Mrs. Carter?" he whispered. The young guard stared at the photograph again before looking back at me with growing confusion. Up close, I could see the panic beginning to settle behind his eyes. "I am so sorry, Mrs. Carter," he whispered. "I did not realize who you were." I gave him a tired smile because at that moment, I was not entirely sure I remembered who I was either. "It is all right," I told him softly. "Most people in there have forgotten too." Behind us, laughter drifted out from the dining room again, louder now that the uncomfortable moment had passed. Vanessa always had a talent for restoring a room after cruelty. She could insult someone with a smile, so polished people almost felt guilty for noticing the insult at all. The guard introduced himself as Marcus and awkwardly offered to help me to my car. I nodded, even though my legs still worked perfectly fine. It was pride that felt weak tonight, not my body. The cold evening air hit my face the moment the country club doors opened. October in Northern California carried a particular chill after sunset, sharp enough to slip through fabric and settle into your bones. My silver sedan sat alone near the edge of the parking lot beneath rows of expensive luxury vehicles that probably cost more than my first home with Richard. For a moment, I simply stood there listening to the faint sound of music from inside the club while memories rose quietly to the surface. 40 years earlier, Richard and I used to arrive at places like this carrying folding brochures and wine samples in the trunk of our old pickup truck. Back then, nobody wanted meetings with small vineyard owners from Napa trying to compete against established brands. I still remembered balancing accounting books at the kitchen table while Daniel slept upstairs. I remembered bottling wine beside Richard until 2 in the morning because we could not afford extra workers yet. I remembered sewing the curtains in our first tasting room myself because every dollar mattered. We built Carter Estates one exhausting year at a time, brick by brick, harvest by harvest. And now my own daughter-in-law had me removed from a dinner like I was some confused stranger who wandered in off the street. Marcus cleared his throat carefully beside me. "Mrs. Carter, may I ask you something?" I looked over at him. "Did your family really not know you were coming tonight?" I almost laughed at the question because the truth felt far more humiliating. "Oh, they knew," I said quietly. "Vanessa personally called me 3 times this week to make sure I attended." His expression darkened. "Then why would she?" He stopped himself before finishing. "Because even strangers understood what my own son refused to admit. This was not an accident. It was performance. Public humiliation wrapped in expensive perfume and white tablecloths." I opened my purse for my keys when Marcus suddenly spoke again. "My father worked at your winery for almost 20 years, he said. He used to tell me about you and your husband all the time. He said Mrs. Carter remembered every employee's birthday." The words caught me off guard harder than Vanessa's insult had. Kindness becomes dangerous when people stop seeing you as human. They begin treating it like weakness instead of character. I looked down at my wedding ring, still resting on my finger 3 years after Richard's death. The diamond was small by country club standards. Vanessa once called it outdated during a Christmas dinner. Richard bought that ring after 6 months of overtime shifts and skipped meals. I had treasured it every single day since 1978. "Your father sounds like a good man," I told Marcus gently. He hesitated before speaking again. "Mrs. Carter, there is something else you should know. Before dinner started, your daughter-in-law told the staff you might try to ask guests for money tonight." My hand froze against my purse. Marcus looked deeply uncomfortable now. "She said you had become unstable after your husband passed away and that we should quietly remove you if you caused a scene." For several seconds, I could not speak at all. The pain was no longer sharp. It had become something colder, heavier, the kind that settles into your chest and changes the shape of your heart forever. I drove home with both hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary while the lights of downtown Napa blurred softly through my windshield. Traffic moved slowly along Main Street, couples drifting out of restaurants, groups laughing beneath patio heaters, waiters stacking chairs for closing time. Ordinary life continued as if nothing had happened. That always amazed me about humiliation. The world never pauses for it. Somewhere between the country club and my neighborhood, the shock inside me began settling into something quieter, more dangerous. By the time I pulled into the driveway of my small white farmhouse, I no longer felt like crying. I felt awake. The porch light glowed warmly against the dark October sky. Richard used to leave it on whenever I worked late at the winery because he hated the thought of me walking into darkness alone. 3 years after his death, I still could not bring myself to turn it off at night. I stepped inside and was immediately greeted by silence, so complete it almost echoed. No television humming from the den. No smell of Richard's coffee brewing before bed. No heavy footsteps crossing the old hardwood floors. Just the faint ticking of the grandfather clock near the staircase. I set my purse down carefully on the kitchen counter and stared at the framed photographs lining the wall beside the refrigerator. Daniel at 8 years old holding his first baseball glove. Daniel graduating from Stanford beside Richard. All 3 of us smiling so hard our cheeks hurt. Daniel dancing with me at his wedding while Vanessa watched from across the ballroom in a white satin gown worth more than my first car. I remembered that night clearly now. Vanessa had hugged me tightly during the reception and whispered, "Thank you for raising such a successful man." At the time, I thought it sounded respectful. Looking back, I realized she had never once thanked me for raising a kind one. I poured myself a glass of water but did not drink it. My hands still felt cold from Marcus's words outside the country club. "Unstable after your husband passed away. Asking guests for money." I leaned against the counter and closed my eyes for a moment. Suddenly memories began connecting themselves one after another, like puzzle pieces finally locking into place. Last Thanksgiving when Vanessa insisted I sit at the children's table because the investors needed more appropriate seating. The Christmas party where my family photo had been removed from the company slideshow entirely. The charity gala invitation addressed only to Daniel and Vanessa, even though the foundation still carried my initials in its legal name. Every insult had arrived wrapped in perfect manners. Quiet enough to deny, sharp enough to wound. My phone buzzed softly against the counter. Daniel's name appeared on the screen. For one weak moment, my heart lifted. I thought perhaps he had finally found his courage. Perhaps he was calling to apologize. I answered immediately. "Mom," he said with an exhausted sigh before I could speak. "Vanessa is really upset about tonight. Not upset for me. Not ashamed. Upset." I looked out the kitchen window toward the dark vineyard hills beyond my property line. "I see," I answered quietly. "You embarrassed her," Daniel continued. People were staring. "You know how important these dinners are for the business." Something inside me went completely still then. Not broken, not shattered, simply still. "Daniel," I asked softly, "did you know she planned to remove me from that dinner?" Silence filled the line for several long seconds. Then he said the one sentence I do not think I will ever forget for the rest of my life. "Mom, maybe it would help if you stopped making everything about yourself." I slowly lowered myself into one of the kitchen chairs Richard built by hand nearly 30 years earlier. The wood creaked softly beneath me. My son had not defended me because he no longer saw me as someone worth defending. Outside, the wind moved gently through the vineyard trees while somewhere deep in the house the grandfather clock struck 10 slow times. And for the first time since Richard died, I began wondering if my husband had left behind more than grief. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Daniel lowering his gaze at the country club while strangers watched his mother being escorted away like an inconvenience. Around 3 in the morning, I gave up pretending rest would come and walked downstairs wrapped in Richard's old gray cardigan. The kitchen smelled faintly of cedar and coffee grounds, familiar scents that somehow made loneliness feel sharper instead of softer. I switched on the small lamp above the stove instead of the overhead lights. Richard always hated bright kitchens at night. He used to say soft lighting made people kinder to each other. I stood there for a long moment wondering what he would think if he could see what had become of our family now. Outside the windows, the vineyard stretched dark and silent beneath the moonlight. Nearly 40 acres of land. Rows and rows of vines Richard once walked personally every morning before sunrise. People loved to talk about the success of Carter Estates now. The magazine interviews, the charity auctions, the celebrity partnerships. But nobody talked about the winters when pipes froze and Richard repaired them himself because we could not afford contractors. Nobody talked about me balancing payroll checks while pregnant with Daniel or spending weekends pouring wine samples at grocery stores because every bottle sold mattered. Success always looks elegant once enough time passes. The ugly parts disappear first. I opened one of the kitchen drawers searching for tea bags when I noticed something buried beneath old receipts and instruction manuals. A brass key. Small, heavy, familiar. My fingers tightened around it instantly. I had not seen that key in years. Richard used to keep it on his office ring until the final weeks before his heart attack. "If anything ever happens to me," he once said while pressing the key into my palm during one particularly difficult harvest season, "promise me you will not let anyone make you feel powerless in your own home." At the time I laughed because the idea seemed ridiculous. Back then Daniel still hugged me every Sunday before leaving dinner. Back then Vanessa still brought flowers on birthdays and called me mom in front of guests. I slipped the key into my robe pocket and quietly walked toward Richard's old study at the far end of the hallway. I had barely entered the room since his funeral. The air still carried traces of his leather cologne mixed with dust and old paper. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling. Business journals, wine catalogs, framed photographs from decades of harvest celebrations. His desk remained exactly as he left it, untouched except for a thin layer of time settling over everything. My eyes moved toward the painting hanging beside the fireplace. Napa Valley at sunset. Richard bought it during our 25th anniversary trip and refused to negotiate the price because he said beauty deserved respect. Behind that painting sat a small wall safe almost nobody knew existed. My pulse slowed strangely as I stepped closer. Suddenly, I remembered something else. 2 months before Richard died, Vanessa started asking unusual questions during dinner. Casual questions. Harmless questions. Who handles the trust now? Does Daniel automatically inherit voting rights? What happens if Evelyn ever wants to retire somewhere smaller? At the time, I assumed she was trying to help organize the future. Now the memory felt different. Calculated. I entered the combination carefully, my fingers trembling only once. The safe clicked open with a dull metallic sound that echoed softly through the room. Inside sat neatly organized documents, property records, and a dark blue folder with my name written across the front in Richard's unmistakable handwriting. Evelyn Carter. Private. My throat tightened instantly. I carried the folder to the desk and slowly opened it beneath the warm yellow desk lamp. On top rested a sealed envelope. Across the front, Richard had written only one sentence. If they ever make you feel small, read this immediately. I stared at Richard's handwriting for a very long time before opening the envelope. My fingers traced the slight indentation of the ink across the paper, like touching a part of him that still existed somewhere beyond memory. Finally, I unfolded the letter carefully beneath the desk lamp. Evelyn, if you are reading this, then someone has mistaken your kindness for weakness. I warned them not to. I had to stop reading for a moment because suddenly the room felt too quiet. Richard always understood people faster than I did. I spent most of my life believing love automatically created loyalty. Richard used to say loyalty only revealed itself when money, power, or pride entered the room. Slowly, I continued reading. Daniel has a good heart, but he wants approval too badly. And Vanessa does not love quietly. She loves ownership. If she ever begins treating you like a burden instead of family, you need to remember something important. Carter Estates was never built for greed. It was built for you. My eyes burned as I turned the page. Attached beneath the letter sat several legal documents stamped with signatures and official seals. I recognized the logo immediately. Whitmore and Lang, Richard's attorneys for nearly 30 years. I adjusted my glasses and read more carefully, line by line, while the grandfather clock ticked steadily behind me. The majority ownership of Carter Estates had never transferred to Daniel after Richard's death. Not fully. 80% remained protected inside an irrevocable family trust under my authority as primary trustee. My breath caught softly in my throat. Daniel managed operations. Vanessa managed public relations and charity events. But legally, neither of them actually controlled the company. They were beneficiaries. Employees with elegant titles. Nothing more. I leaned back slowly in Richard's leather chair as realization settled over me piece by piece. Vanessa had spent years behaving like the queen of an empire she did not own. Worse than that, Daniel knew enough to suspect the truth. That explained the sudden tension every time legal paperwork appeared during family dinners. That explained why Vanessa always changed the subject whenever I asked financial questions during company events. Richard had protected me without ever fully telling me how. My eyes moved toward the final page inside the folder. There, clipped neatly beneath the trust agreement, sat a handwritten note from Mr. Whitmore himself. Mrs. Carter, per Richard's instructions, this file was to remain sealed unless circumstances required your direct intervention. If that time has come, contact me immediately. There are additional provisions you should understand before making any decisions regarding Daniel or Mrs. Carter. Mrs. Carter, not Vanessa. Even after all these years, the lawyers still did not think of her as family. I closed the folder slowly and stared across the dark office. The humiliation at the country club suddenly looked different in my memory now. Smaller somehow. Vanessa thought she was removing an unwanted old woman from a dinner table. She never realized she was publicly humiliating the majority owner of the very company funding her entire lifestyle. A strange calm settled over me then. Not revenge. Not anger. Clarity. For months I had questioned myself constantly. Maybe I was too emotional after Richard's death. Maybe I was becoming difficult. Maybe age really was making me overly sensitive. But unstable people do not spend years quietly observing patterns. They do not notice calculated exclusions or carefully staged disrespect. Cruelty always leaves fingerprints eventually. The house creaked softly as wind moved through the vineyard outside. Dawn would arrive in a few hours. Somewhere across town, Vanessa was probably sleeping peacefully beside my son in their oversized hillside estate, bought partly with profits from land Richard and I once harvested ourselves by hand. I thought about Marcus standing awkwardly beside me in the parking lot. I thought about Daniel telling me to stop making everything about myself. Then I looked down at Richard's final sentence written at the bottom of the page in dark blue ink. Never beg for a seat at a table you built. The next morning, I woke before sunrise for the first time in months without feeling lost. Grief had changed my routines after Richard died. I used to stay in bed too long staring at the empty side beside me, listening to the silence stretch across the house like fog. But that morning felt different. Purpose has a way of pulling people forward even when pain still lingers underneath everything else. I dressed carefully in dark slacks and a cream blouse Richard always liked because he said it made me look strong without trying too hard. Then I drove into town just as the first pale light touched the vineyard hills surrounding Napa Valley. Whitmore and Lane occupied the top floor of an old sandstone building near the courthouse. Richard loved that office because he trusted old institutions more than modern ones. If a law firm still uses oak bookshelves and fountain pens, he used to joke, they probably know how to protect your money. The receptionist looked startled when I introduced myself. "Mrs. Carter," she said quickly while standing straighter in her chair. "Mr. Whitmore will want to see you immediately." That sentence alone told me more than she realized. Important people still recognized my name, even if my own family had stopped respecting it. Harold Whitmore looked older than I remembered when he entered the conference room 10 minutes later. His silver hair had thinned considerably since Richard's funeral, but his sharp blue eyes remained exactly the same. The moment he saw the dark blue folder resting beside me on the table, his expression changed from polite professionalism to quiet understanding. "I was wondering when you would finally open it," he said softly while taking the seat across from me. I folded my hands carefully together. Richard thought this day might come. Harold gave a slow nod. Your husband understood people very well. For the next hour, he explained everything Richard had arranged before his death. Carter Estates had been intentionally structured so that no single family member besides me could ever control the company completely. Richard feared greed more than competition. He feared entitlement more than failure. The trust protected the winery, the land, and even employee pensions from reckless leadership decisions. And most importantly, certain behavioral clauses had been included very specifically after Vanessa entered the family. Behavioral clauses? I repeated quietly. Harold slid a legal document toward me across the polished table. Your husband insisted on them after several uncomfortable incidents during his final year. I adjusted my glasses and began reading slowly. Any beneficiary found guilty of deliberate public humiliation, financial manipulation, elder neglect, or intentional reputational harm toward the acting trustee could immediately lose access to trust distributions and executive authority, pending board review. My heartbeat slowed instead of quickened. Richard had seen it long before I did. He documented concerns privately. Harold continued carefully. Especially after Mrs. Carter began excluding you from company functions while increasing her own public visibility. I looked up sharply. You knew? Harold's expression tightened with visible discomfort. Several people noticed, Evelyn. Your husband included. Suddenly memories returned with painful clarity. Vanessa interrupting me during investor dinners. Vanessa introducing herself as the founder's successor while I stood nearby, smiling politely. Vanessa gradually moving me farther away from every important conversation connected to the winery. I had mistaken ambition for confidence because I wanted peace more than confrontation. Harold leaned back slowly in his chair. There is something else you need to understand, he said. Vanessa believes Daniel inherited majority ownership after Richard's death. Legally, she has been operating under assumptions that are entirely incorrect. Outside the conference room windows, downtown Napa bustled. Quietly through another ordinary morning. Delivery trucks passed coffee shops. Tourists wandered sidewalks holding pastries and paper cups. Nobody outside that office knew an entire family power structure was beginning to collapse. Harold folded his hands together and looked directly at me. Evelyn, as of this moment, you have every legal right to remove both Daniel and Vanessa from executive control of Carter Estates. I stared at him silently, while Richard's final sentence echoed again in my mind. Never beg for a seat at a table you built. For the next several days, I said nothing to Daniel or Vanessa. That surprised even me. Years ago, I would have called immediately. I would have tried to fix things, smooth things over, explain my feelings until everyone felt comfortable again. But something inside me had shifted the night I opened Richard's letter. Silence no longer felt weak. It felt strategic. On Wednesday morning, an elegant cream envelope arrived at my farmhouse by courier. I recognized the Carter Estate's gold seal instantly. Annual Harvest Gala. Black tie. Saturday evening at the Vineyard Estate. Vanessa loved the Harvest Gala more than any event of the year. She treated it less like a charity fundraiser and more like a royal coronation. Every influential family in Napa attended. Investors, local politicians, hospitality executives, wine critics from San Francisco and Los Angeles. Vanessa spent months planning floral arrangements and press photography as though the future of civilization depended on imported orchids and seating charts. In previous years, she always made sure I sat quietly near the back beside retired board members and elderly spouses. Visible enough for appearances, harmless enough not to interfere. This year, however, my invitation included something unusual. Reserved seating at the founder's table. I stared at the card for several long seconds before reaching for my phone. Harold Whitmore answered immediately. "You received the invitation," he said calmly. "You arranged this?" I asked. "No," he replied. "The board did." That answer told me everything. People inside the company were beginning to move carefully around Vanessa now. Rumors travel quickly in wealthy communities, especially after public humiliation at a country club involving a recognizable family name. I could almost picture the quiet conversations already happening behind closed office doors. "Did you hear what happened to Evelyn Carter?" Apparently, security escorted her out. Vanessa may have gone too far this time. Wealthy people tolerate cruelty surprisingly well until it becomes embarrassing publicly. Saturday evening arrived colder than expected for late October. I stood in front of my bedroom mirror fastening the pearl earrings Richard gave me during our 10th anniversary trip to Monterey. Simple earrings. Not flashy. Richard always believed confidence should enter a room before jewelry did. I chose a long black velvet gown hidden in the back of my closet for years because Vanessa once laughed gently and called it too mature for public events. Looking at myself now, I realized mature was simply another word younger people used when they feared dignity they had not earned yet. The Vineyard Estate glowed beneath hundreds of hanging lights when I arrived just after 7. Valets hurried across the circular driveway while photographers snapped pictures near the entrance fountain. I noticed several heads turning the moment I stepped from the car. Not dramatically, just enough. Recognition mixed with surprise. Good. Inside the ballroom, soft jazz drifted through crystal chandeliers while waiters carried trays of champagne between tables decorated with white roses and gold candles. Large photographs from Carter Estate's history lined the walls. Harvest crews from the 1980s. Richard pouring wine for customers during our first trade show. Me standing beside him, wearing jeans and muddy boots while holding pruning shears. The real story of the winery. Not the polished fantasy Vanessa preferred for magazine interviews. I had barely stepped farther into the ballroom when the room suddenly quieted in small, uneven waves. Across the far side near the stage, Vanessa stood frozen mid-conversation, holding a champagne glass between perfectly manicured fingers. Beside her, Daniel looked genuinely shocked to see me there at all. For a brief moment, nobody moved. Vanessa recovered first. She smiled brightly, though the corners looked strained. "Evelyn," she called while approaching me carefully. "We were not expecting you tonight." I held her gaze calmly. "That is interesting," I answered softly, "considering my name is still on the building." Vanessa's smile tightened almost invisibly after my response, but years of practicing social charm kept her voice smooth. "Of course," she said lightly while touching my arm as if we were close friends instead of enemies wearing family titles. "I only meant we thought you might still be upset after the misunderstanding at the country club." Misunderstanding. Wealthy people love that word. It transformed cruelty into inconvenience. Around us, conversations resumed carefully, though I noticed several guests still watching from behind lifted champagne glasses. Daniel stepped forward at last, looking deeply uncomfortable inside his tailored tuxedo. "Mom," he said quietly, "can we talk privately for a minute?" I studied his face for a moment before nodding. He guided me toward the far terrace overlooking the vineyards where strings of lights glowed softly against the dark hills. The cold evening air carried the scent of crushed grapes and fireplace smoke. For a second, standing there beside my son beneath the lights, I almost remembered what it felt like when family still meant safety. Daniel loosened his bow tie slightly and exhaled hard. "What are you doing here tonight?" he asked under his breath. "I was invited," I answered calmly. By the board, apparently. His expression changed immediately. Not anger. Fear. Small, but unmistakable. Mom, he said carefully. You know Vanessa can be intense sometimes, but showing up like this after what happened? After what happened? I repeated softly. You mean after your wife had me removed from a dinner in front of half the city? He rubbed a hand across his face. You are making this bigger than it needs to be. I looked out over the vineyard rows stretching endlessly beneath the moonlight. No, Daniel, I said quietly. I spent years making it smaller than it was. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, a voice echoed through the ballroom speakers behind us. Ladies and gentlemen, if we could have your attention for a special presentation honoring the legacy of Carter Estates. Daniel froze instantly. Through the ballroom windows, I saw Vanessa standing near the stage beside a large projection screen, smiling confidently toward the crowd. This was her favorite part of every gala. The carefully staged tribute, the polished speeches, the illusion of inherited elegance. Daniel glanced nervously toward the ballroom. We should go back inside, he muttered. The ballroom lights dimmed as guests returned to their tables. Vanessa stood center stage in a shimmering silver gown, every movement perfectly rehearsed. Tonight, she began warmly. We celebrate not only another successful harvest season, but the future of Carter Estates. Applause followed politely. She continued speaking about growth, innovation, expansion into international markets. Every sentence positioned herself and Daniel as the natural evolution of the company. Modern leadership, modern vision, modern image. Then the large projection screen behind her flickered unexpectedly. Vanessa paused mid-sentence. Confusion crossed her face briefly. Instead of the polished promotional video she clearly expected, an old home recording appeared on the screen. Grainy footage from the 1980s filled the ballroom. Richard stood beside me wearing dusty work boots and a faded denim jacket while young employees laughed during harvest season. I looked barely 35, hair tied back with dirt on my jeans, carrying grape crates across muddy ground. More clips followed. Richard building wine racks by hand. Me balancing accounting ledgers at the kitchen table while holding toddler Daniel on my lap. The room grew quieter with every passing second. Nobody touched their champagne now. At the bottom of the screen appeared white lettering. Founders of Carter Estates, Richard and Evelyn Carter. Vanessa turned sharply toward the audiovisual staff near the back of the ballroom. What is this? She hissed loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. But before anyone answered, Harold Whitmore calmly stepped onto the stage holding a folder beneath one arm. The entire room seemed to stop breathing at once. Harold Whitmore adjusted the microphone calmly while the final image of Richard and me faded behind him on the massive screen. The ballroom remained completely silent except for the soft clink of silverware being set down across distant tables. Vanessa stood frozen beside the stage, still holding her champagne glass, though her hand no longer looked steady. Harold opened the dark folder in front of him with the slow precision of a man who had delivered difficult truths for decades. Good evening, he began evenly. For those who may not know me, I served as legal counsel for Richard Carter and Carter Estates for nearly 30 years. Several guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. Daniel had gone pale beside me near the terrace entrance. Harold continued without raising his voice once. Before his passing, Richard Carter established a series of legal protections regarding ownership and executive authority within Carter Estates winery. Vanessa stepped forward quickly. Harold, she interrupted with a strained laugh. Perhaps this is not the appropriate setting for legal discussions. He looked directly at her over the rim of his glasses. Actually, Mrs. Carter, your public treatment of the acting trustee has made this precisely the appropriate setting. The room seemed to tighten around those words. Across the ballroom, I noticed several board members sitting perfectly still now, avoiding eye contact with Vanessa entirely. Harold lifted a document from the folder. As of this evening, due to documented violations of behavioral conduct clauses established by Richard Carter himself, executive review proceedings are being initiated regarding both Daniel Carter and Vanessa Carter. Vanessa blinked rapidly. I do not understand what that means. Harold folded the paper carefully. It means neither of you own Carter Estates. The silence afterward felt enormous. Daniel stared at Harold as though the floor beneath him had shifted unexpectedly. Vanessa let out a short, nervous laugh that sounded painfully artificial in the quiet ballroom. That is ridiculous, she said sharply. Daniel inherited this company 3 years ago. No, Harold replied calmly. Daniel inherited responsibilities. Ownership remained protected under the Carter family trust under the authority of Evelyn Carter. Slowly, dozens of eyes turned toward me across the ballroom. For years I had sat quietly at the edges of these events while Vanessa occupied center stage, smiling for photographs beneath my family name. Tonight nobody looked at her anymore. Vanessa's face lost color visibly. There must be some mistake, she whispered. Harold closed the folder. There is no mistake. She looked toward Daniel desperately now, waiting for him to deny it, fix it, restore the illusion she had built her entire life around. But my son simply stood there speechless because somewhere deep down, he had always known his father never trusted greed. Vanessa suddenly stepped toward me in heels that clicked too loudly against the ballroom floor. Evelyn, she said quickly, lowering her voice into something almost pleading. If this is about the country club incident, people misunderstood the situation. I looked at her calmly for a long moment. Then I remembered Marcus apologizing beside the parking lot while strangers watched me leave alone. I remembered Daniel asking why I was making things difficult. I remembered every holiday table where Vanessa slowly pushed me farther from my own family while pretending kindness for the cameras. No, I answered softly. People understood perfectly. Vanessa's lips parted slightly, but no words came out this time. Nearby, a waiter quietly approached our table carrying seating cards for the remainder of the evening. He hesitated awkwardly beside Vanessa before looking toward me instead. Mrs. Carter, he asked respectfully, where would you like the founder's table arranged? Founder's table. Not Daniel's table. Not Vanessa's event. Mine. I glanced across the ballroom toward the center table beneath the chandelier, where Vanessa had seated herself every year since Richard died. Then I looked back at the waiter with a calm smile. Right where it belongs, I said softly. And for the first time in many years, nobody questioned my place. In the room.